I'm the bad guy. Duh.
Get ready, it's time for the Daily Breakdown with Mr. Keelan. Bet you're pretty disturbed now, huh? Figure a lot of you probably thought I was being a bad guy making you watch all these videos, so there's my treat for you. Keelan Eilish or Billy Keelan or I don't know. You'll never unsee that. Anyway, happy Thursday. Hope you're doing fabulous. Let's get into another flip lesson. Shout out to my Amistadians, all my friends from House Amistad. Hope you've been doing great this week. We got one more school day to go for this week and one more day for both of the units that we've been dealing with from the work that we sent home in the beginning. So we're almost there. Almost there. Let's get into the video, shall we? All right, we're almost through our chapter on the Constitutional Convention. Let's get into our lesson for the day and its objectives. First, I'd like you to be able to analyze the reasons why the founders within the Constitution wanted to find ways to limit the power of the federal government. We talked a lot about how they wanted a stronger national government, but also they feared a strong national government, and they were looking for ways to balance those two things. To this end, I'd like you, in your own words, to be able to explain what enumerated powers or federalism is, separation of powers, and checks and balances. 8th graders, you should be a bit familiar with those terms. So let's talk about why they wanted a limited government. Our founders wanted to balance the need to have a strong national government with the need to protect state and individual rights. Our founders were very mindful of the fact that they fought a war against what they saw as a tyrannical king and parliament in England that abused their powers grossly in many different ways during the American Revolution and the lead up to the American Revolution, giving soldiers a blank check to kill colonists and get away with it. Allowing soldiers to search and seize property without a warrant, denying trial by jury, denying religious freedom. We talked about many different ways that the British government was oppressive to the Americans. They wanted to have ways to make sure that the government they were putting in place could never do those things. But the other end, they also wanted to have a government that was strong enough to handle national affairs. To this end, they wanted to limit the government with the Constitution. And there's key principles of the Constitution that reflect this ideal to limit government. One is enumerated powers, which I often refer to as federalism. Next will be the separation of powers, and lastly, checks and balances. So let's get to it, shall we? One of the ways that they wanted to limit the federal government's power was to very strictly define what powers the federal government had in the Constitution. Use the Constitution as a way to limit the federal government. Enumerated powers are the powers that the U.S. Government has listed in the Constitution. To enumerate means to list. So to this end, federal government is in charge of big issues that affect everybody, the whole country. Wouldn't make sense for one state to be in charge of defense and making an army, or negotiating foreign affairs with foreign leaders and setting treaties, or being in charge of printing money. There's many other different things that the federal government has as its sole responsibility. But on the other end, it doesn't make sense for the federal government to be in charge of things that are more local and state affected. For example, it doesn't make sense for Congress to decide what the speed limit should be in your town, or to decide on how sanitation laws are going to be in effect of how garbage will be picked up, or to set what standards should be for your education. Your education, the curriculum and everything was set by the Board of Education, which is a local government authority. that then meets state standards from the state's authority. This is a reflection of that idea of federalism or enumerated powers, that there's different levels of the government, and at different levels, the federal, the state, and the local are in charge of different things. And once again, we want to limit the power of the government to not get involved in these things. Well, if we look politically throughout our history, though, this is a big bone of contention that's been debated. We see that, for example, debates on whether or not there should be a federal Department of Education, Environmental Protection, Department of Energy, if the government should be dealing with healthcare. These are issues that aren't necessarily written in the Constitution. Many argue that they should not, the national government should not be involved in those things. Others argue, well, these are issues that affect the whole country and the livelihood of the whole country, so the national government needs to deal with it. And that is a debate for another day, but just want to give you a kind of bit of a preview of how enumerated powers and federalism is still talked about today. Another idea is, and this is a crucial idea, is the separation of powers. Our founders were fearful of a tyranny, of a dictatorship, of one person having absolute power and acting in a cruel and selfish way, like the king was to them. Keep in mind that a government is a very powerful institution. The government has the power to tax and take your money. The government has the power to go to war and have you have to fight and possibly die for your nation. These are pretty immense powers a government has. And in order to try to stop that power from being abused, our founders modeled something after the Romans, and that was to separate out power, to split it up. If all of the power is held by one person, then if they mess up everything. But instead, if it's split up, we can make sure that A, one person is in charge of too much, and B, we can make sure that if somebody is not that great, we have two other branches that can kind of put them back in place. So to this end, the U.S. Constitution splits the federal government up in three co-equal branches, meaning that one is not more powerful than the others, or is designed not to be. Eighth graders, I notice, a bit redundant, but I'm going to go just very quickly through them because we'll go through these in a lot more detail when we go through the Constitution and the branches of government. But key thing I want you to understand is what each one is and what their main gigs are and who are the main groups of people within them. So the Article 1 of the Constitution deals with the legislative branch. Their main job is to legislate. To legislate means to make laws. The main body of the legislative branch is the U.S. Congress, which, as we talked about in the previous lesson, is a bicameral institution, meaning that it has two chambers or two houses within it, the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. No laws can get passed without both of them agreeing on it. So the legislative makes the laws. So if you have laws made, you need police to enforce the laws. The police of the federal government to execute, to enforce or carry out the laws is the executive branch. That's headed up by the President of the United States. The President has a wide administration. I know this graphic shows the Vice President. Really, underneath the President should be hundreds of thousands of other people that work to execute out the law according to the President's policies, as far as how they want the laws enforced. Lastly, we have the judicial branch. Yes, judicial, not judical. Please don't pronounce it that way. The judicial branch, think judicial, has judge, similar root in the beginning. Well, that's who we have. They're judges. They settle disputes about the law. They interpret what the Constitution and laws mean. And if there's an argument about what the law means, and if there's a conflict, In it, they settled that dispute. So at the highest level, that is the U.S. Supreme Court, also known as the SCOTUS. The Supreme Court of the United States deals with cases where there is conflicts in constitutional law. But underneath them is a set of federal courts and then state courts and then your local courts, which also settle disputes about the law. Last but not least is the system of checks and balances. It was very important to our founders that the three branches of government were co-equal, that one never got too powerful. So they thought the best way of stopping any one branch from abusing power was giving the other branches the ability to slap them back in place, to check them if they get out of line. So if you check in somebody, if you ever heard the expression, check yourself before you wreck yourself, well, that's the idea, that if the president is abusing power, then the legislative or the judicial branch have the ability to check them back, to put them in place. And I always think of this as a hockey, within the terms of hockey. In the game hockey, if there's one player who's acting a bit out of line, they usually send out one other player, usually they're nicknamed the goon, who goes and this will slam that person against the glass, like this person seen here. I think the glass is breaking. The guy's getting checked so hard. But the idea is that the president can check the Congress or the judicial. Judicial can check the president or the Congress, and the Congress can check the president and the judicial. They want to make sure that none of them step out of line. And this is a quick little graphic that simplifies some of the checks and balances that the three branches have. So in this scenario, the Uncle Sam hat's the president, the building is the Capitol building, that's the Congress, and the gavel and scales is the judicial branch. And you can see starting with the president, if president doesn't like the laws that Congress are passing, then they can veto legislation. If the Congress feels that the president is acting out of line or abusing power, they can impeach or remove the president. They can similarly remove judges if they are acting out of line. The president has the power to nominate judges to the judicial branch. So you can't become part of the U.S. Supreme Court unless a president picks you out. And the judicial branch has the power of judicial review, which can declare any law or any act of a president unconstitutional and basically cancel them out. So they each have ways of canceling out or checking the other ones and smacking them back in place if they step out of line. So your question for the lesson is, I want you to pick out two of the principles we talked about, either enumerated powers, separation of powers, or checks and balances, and describe them in your own words in the comment below. Thanks so much for watching. Have a marvelous day.